Welcome to the podcast, our very first episode of 70 times 7. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is DJ, and this is my dad, Pastor Danny, and we're just super excited for what this podcast has in store, from everything from just fun stories, life experiences, or even more serious topics like good advice, biblical advice. Our goal is just to give you another perspective of the world and kind of, from two different generations, two different upbringings, two different life paths. And it's so interesting because we end up in a very similar path of life, and we have so much planned. We have so much in store for this podcast, and so we're super excited. You have anything?
That's crazy. I mean, just to think about that, two different backgrounds, but ending up basically in the same place.
Yeah.
And God using us, and it just reminds me of how God can take two different backgrounds, two different personalities, even though you're my son and we're related, but two different personalities, and God can use us both equally for his kingdom. And I just think it's cool. I'm so excited for 70 times 7, and I think this is going to be amazing. I'm so excited about it. Two different perspectives on the world, on the church, on people, on human beings, and Christian perspective. I'm just excited about it because we talk about Christian perspective, but we're real people, and so you come from a place of realness and a place of transparency. I think that makes everything safer and more palatable.
Yeah. So our goal for this first episode, we're going to talk about kind of a topic that you hear every once in a while, a debate that always rises up. But the biggest thing is what it's called is nature versus nurture. And I thought a good way for you guys to kind of get to know us a little bit is through this topic, through this, not debate, but just as we discuss what is nature versus nurture, what side would we kind of fall on? Kind of just talk about our childhood, our upbringings, life choices, life decisions, all that kind of stuff. And kind of, by the end of this, hopefully we come to a good consensus or a good conclusion, or you get something out of this discussion. And so nature versus nurture. And so I'm going to just read you a quick just definition. If you just Google what is nature versus nurture, right? So it comes up with these two different definitions, right? So nature refers to the biological and genetic factors that influence an individual's traits, including physical characteristics, predispositions, and some personality traits. While nurture, it encompasses the environmental factors that shape an individual's development, such as upbringing, experiences, social interactions, and cultural influences. Right. And so, you have all different types of people, different walks of life, personalities. And, I feel like it's very easy for people to blame it on one thing or the other. Oh, well, this was just how I was raised. Or, oh, well, this is my ethnicity, or, oh, this is where I grew up. Or, it's very easy to kind of blame shift personality traits, faults, or, whatever it is. So I kind of just want to start with asking you, tell us what your childhood was like. So what was your upbringing like?
My upbringing was very interesting because in a lot of ways, it was amazing. Being raised in Queens, New York, in a place called Ridgewood, Queens, and we were real close to the border of Brooklyn, and the city life, So you didn't necessarily need vehicles, you would take buses and trains and then walk. You would walk a lot, and so just being raised in the city was a lot different than where we currently live in York, PA. And so I think just that. So like, for example, I'd walk to school, where, you and the other kids, like, you always had a bus or a van. So like every day I walked to school every day. And it was like a 15-minute walk, just something as simple as that, just like a 15-minute walk or 20-minute walk. And you'd stop at the store, the bakery to get a bagel or whatever and coffee. It was just a different life than just being picked up by a bus and being right to your doorstep of the school. So, I would say city life. Me and Mom were talking about this like the other day, just like, talking about the playgrounds, know, how different the playgrounds were in the parks. Just, I mean, from monkey bars to like, sometimes we laugh at how amazing the parks are, in Pennsylvania and probably a lot of the world, besides, like the city of New York. But, just we were laughing the other day where, we would climb on the monkey bars and there's like broken glass and like, needle syringes, like underneath. So if you fall, you could get busted open with broken glass or like, a needle or whatever the case may be. And then, we used to have a friend that lived across the street from the park and he would go home real quick, sometimes get a broom the stuff and then, whatever. But, just from the parks to the schools to the modes of transportation to the accents to the food to the sense of the city, and the different ethnicities of the city and the attitude, the attitude of the city, it's just amazing. So what a different life it was for me growing up in the city versus, you guys. Just so for any audience that doesn't know, DJ's my son. My name's Danny, DJ, and we have 4 children. DJ's the oldest of the 4. So, the thing is just watching life through your eyes and your siblings' eyes has been, in some ways, just an education in itself because it's just completely different than how I was raised, and being raised in New York versus York, Pennsylvania. So I think it does mold you. I think it does shape you. Just like I think York, and your surroundings have shaped you.
Now, at what point of your life, I guess, figure childhood, birth until maybe 12, 13, that's really kind of when everything is filtered through your parents, probably from like that range.
Yeah.
So I know when you were first born into early childhood, both of your parents weren't saved. So what was life like during that point? So when it came to like morals, values, like what can you remember about like values or morals or things that you were taught before, any kind of religion or anything like that entered into your family?
Yeah, it's interesting because, just talking about the nurture versus nature thing, I think this applies like immediately. My thoughts go to, even though my mom wasn't a Christian per se, she wasn't a follower of Christ, she had great morals, versus my dad, he wasn't a follower of Christ, but, it wasn't the greatest, when it came to, I guess, morals. But but the interesting thing is he had certain pet peeves. Like he thought cursing was disrespectful. So like he didn't use foul language, but he was an alcoholic and he was a fighter and he had it. So it's so it's amazing like what we deem as bad and what we deem as good and acceptable. And just when you talk about morals, I mean, it probably would have been better sometimes if all he did was use foul language, that would have been better than all the other things that he did. Yeah. So my parents were very different. And so I had 2 different perspectives, as I was in my earlier formative years, I had 2 different perspectives of life, 2 different perspectives of the world, because my mom's family was a lot different than my dad's family. So, so just from an early age, learning all those things by just spending time with family and my parents, learning, oh wow, like my dad's side does things a lot different than my mom's family, So, it was interesting.
Yeah. Now, even then, talking about your mom or my grandma, what do you think made her have good morals? Like, was her family like any sort of religion, or even like, like just technically like Catholic, or technically like,
Yeah.
like what do you think the backbone was for her?
So I think the backbone was her parents. My grandfather was, first generation from Ireland, and then my grandmother from first generation from Germany. And so I think they had some cultural things, but I also think that because they were very religious, and they did follow Catholicism.
Okay.
That was their faith of choice, and they were dedicated. Dedicated Catholics. Like
Yeah.
when you talk about Catholics, I feel like, and this is with I think any
Yeah.
type of belief system or organization, and that is there's extreme, and then there's people that are relaxed, and you would barely know that they had any type of faith at all.
Yeah.
So there's so many extremes, but I would say on the extreme scale, if we could say it that way, my grandfather and my grandmother, which is my mom's parents, they were very loyal and dedicated to the Catholic Church, and they followed the laws, if we could say it that way, of the Catholic Church. And my grandfather, my grandmother, they were faithful in their attendance to mass.
Yeah.
And that would be Saturday nights. They were very dedicated and very loyal and very respectful. I mean, when it comes to what we would call the house of God, like they were very, very respectful when it came to their church and to the priest. And my grandfather was just also a very respectful human being. And so,
Well, I know he was like a firefighter, so kind of like the town's, stand-up guy.
He was. I mean, I think the thing that probably we would say was the worst thing is that he smoked. He smoked cigarettes. Just to make that clarification, because when you say he smoked, you're not sure.
A lot of different things.
But yeah, so he smoked cigarettes, but he was in. It was like the Frank Sinatra age, and just singing and whistling, and he would always wear a hat. And excuse me, and he, like back in those days, those old school guys would, like, if a woman was walking by, he would just tip his hat.
Yeah.
He would help carry groceries, if he saw that, and just different old school things that were obvious, and they were very honoring and respectful. So I think some of that was his personality. Some of it was their upbringing. They were raised kind of strict, but also Catholicism was something that they took very seriously.
Yeah.
And even though he was Catholic and some focus on saints and Mary and things like that, I could say that, they also had a relationship with Christ. And I think that made a big difference. But I think that that really made an influence as far as his morals and how he carried himself and the language that he would use, how he treated his wife, how he treated his children, how he treated the community and neighbors and family and so forth.
Yeah. So then how do you feel like, at least for specifically grandma, like how much of that specifically did she carry over into then her like adult life, in the sense of like Catholicism and stuff like that? Was she heavy into the Catholic Church, or was it just more like, she took the morals of her parents, and so then she was just kind of like a good person?
I do know that her and her siblings went to a Catholic school, and they all did with the Catholic faith, like the, your first communion and baptism, those are like big staples.
Yeah.
And so I think they all did that. And so they did it, I believe, mostly because their parents led in that direction and led them that way. I don't think growing up, though, as the kids got older, like my mom and her siblings, I don't think they took it real seriously. She was one of four, 3 girls and a boy. And I think, not to be biased, but I think if anybody took it seriously, I would think that my mom was probably the one that took it the most seriously out of the 4. But I can't say that for certain. they all went to church because it was something that my grandfather expected.
Okay.
So they all went. But I'm talking about as they grew up, as
Yeah.
they get older, I think my mom, took it seriously. However, I don't think as she got older, I don't think, she was serious about going to church. I mean, she started dating my dad when she was 14.
Yeah.
So I think things like started changing.
Sure.
When she started hanging out with the neighborhood kids and when
Yeah.
she started dating my dad. But it definitely molded, I would say, her.
Yeah.
As far as morals go, as far as that respect. I think some of it was the Catholic Church, but I think a lot of it really was the influence of her parents.
Now, did you have any memory, like, did that ever carry over into her pre-Christian, so did she ever take you to mass? Was that ever a thing on Easter, like, before she was saved?
I think she might have taken me once when I was a kid, but I remember going a couple of times with my grandparents.
Okay, so it was more,
A couple of times with them.
Yeah, with your, okay.
Like if I was, hanging out with them or if I was sleeping at their
Yeah.
house or whatever the case may be, and it just so happened that it was like weekend, then they would go to mass on Saturday, so I would go with them.
Okay, so then how old were you when Grandma gave her life, like kind of just fully committed to the Lord?
I would say I was about the age of 5.
Okay, so still rather young, young enough to still be influenced. So then, so from that point, then like 5, how old were you then when Grandpa gave his life to the Lord?
My guess is around, I was probably about 12.
Because it was on an Easter service, right, that
it was
he
an
gave
Easter,
his life.
Yeah, it was an Easter Sunday morning. I think I was about 12 years old.
So then for that like 7-year span where, it's 2 different morals, 2 different beliefs in the same household, where did you kind of fall with that? And, how did that affect you? Being in a house, you hear about this a lot.
Yeah.
Parents or people, who love each other, they're dating, they're, engaged. But, you might have one person who follows one religion and one who follows the other, or the lack thereof, whatever it is. And so, a lot of times in our shoes today, when we talk to people like that, we typically advise them to either get on the same page or, think of different options because, that could be very hard, not just for the marriage, but that can be hard for the kid.
Sure.
So for you,
It's
did you ever feel that tension or any, describe that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. So my mom, let me just back up. I think even though she grew up Catholic, I think there was, if I can speak for her just a little bit, I think that there was always a sensitivity to things of God.
Sure.
I think she just didn't have the language for it, and possibly like the influence to take her to, another level in her understanding. So when she was working at a bank, her coworker was a Christian and attended a local church, and she had like Bible studies in her home during the week. And so when she was invited to a Bible study by a coworker, that's when she gave her life to Christ at a Bible study in her house.
Yeah.
And, my mom, because she always had, I think, this sensitivity to things of God, I think now this was just an opportunity for her to jump in with both feet and learn and be discipled, and then, try to understand the language of what does it mean to be a follower of Christ and to grow and mature in that. So she jumped in. So I said all that to say, like, she jumped in both feet, like, quick.
Yeah.
You know how some people, they give their life to Christ, and then, sometimes it takes months for
back
them.
and forth, fighting with the old temptations.
Yeah, all that. My mom, though, she was the one who, she gave her life to Christ, and then like within days, like she was all in. Within days, she had a Bible. Within days, she was reading it. Within days, she was attending a church. Like that weekend, she started attending church, and that was it.
Yeah.
Like she jumped like right in, both feet. At the same time, my dad was raised Lutheran, but name only. I mean, they never attended church.
Yeah.
I think, my dad has some stories where his mom would send him to church because it was like a couple of blocks away from the house. And so
Yeah.
she would give him money for the offering. And like he would go to the store and he would,
Spend it.
spend it on candy
Yeah,
or whatever
yeah.
and never make it to the
Yeah.
church. So Lutheran in name only, but my dad's family weren't churchgoers like at all.
Yeah.
And so there was those two different perspectives. Not only did my mom get saved before my dad, but mom was raised with some church knowledge, even though it was the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
But like my dad basically had none. And then of course, my dad in those days was an alcoholic.
Yeah.
And his lifestyle was very different. My mom, you talk about personality and you talk about nature versus nurture, that whole concept.
Yeah.
I mean, they couldn't be two of the most opposite
Yeah.
people. As they got older, it seemed like they aligned more and more and more.
Sure.
But man, in those days, like when I was a kid or when I was in the house, because I left the house, I think when I was like 17. So, but when, I think of the different personalities, they were just so different. My mom was like the good girl and my dad was like, the bad boy, basically. And so you couldn't get no different. So being raised in that environment was a little bit conflicting, for me because I saw both of those in action. I saw my mom was the good girl and my dad was kind of like, he was a nice guy.
Yeah.
But, if you would want to categorize the difference, like he was the bad boy, she was the good girl. So being raised in that, I felt like at times it put me in a predicament because sometimes I felt like I had to choose, like, which one do I want to be?
Yeah.
Do I want to be like mom or do I want to be like dad? And, I naturally lean towards my mom. I guess we would call it like a mama's boy.
Sure.
I naturally lean towards her. However, I lean towards my dad in that I wanted to be like him. And so because of that, I felt like there had to be a certain toughness and there had to be a certain way that you carry yourself and the way you handle yourself, the way you talk, and things like that. And, it's interesting, like it was never taught.
Yeah.
That's why I think it's so critical, even as we, have counseled people over the last, 30 years. It's amazing because sometimes the greatest lessons are not what you say. It's like what you do. Because my dad was never like, all right, so you need to be this, or you need to be that, or you need to be tough, or you need to fight, or you need to, like, he wouldn't say that. But it was just from watching him, what he was and what he exuded, that began to rub off on me more than my mom. And it was interesting because, I did feel kind of stuck, because there was a lot of things I loved about her. There was a lot of things I loved about him. But because they were so different, I felt like I was like in the middle somewhere for many years. So yeah, it was interesting. It was interesting because you did feel like divided in how do I hold myself? How do I carry myself? How do I talk?
So when did you kind of almost, without making a mindful decision, but kind of with your thoughts and your actions, and when did you feel you kind of like made the choice to not live exactly how your mom did?
So that's a whole can of worms. And so the easiest way to explain that, I think, was there was definitely abuse that took place in my earlier years. And the thing that sticks out to me the most is I was sexually abused by one of the leaders in my mom's church. So to give some reference to this, so now remember, my mom's the Christian.
Yeah.
And my dad's not. But my mom forced me to go to church.
Yeah.
And in going to church, basically this abuse developed. And that lasted for 3 years. And
How old were you? Like
it was
that
like
range?
fourth, fifth, and sixth grade.
So that's like what, 7, 8, 9, maybe something like that.
Yeah, fourth, fifth, sixth. I think, to be honest with you, those years are a little foggy. So I think that it could have even, went into like seventh grade even.
Okay.
But, there was, a set of years, whether it was, 3 or 4 years, there was a set of years where this leader, he was a music director at the church, and I always had a love for music, and so I was wanting him to kind of show me the ropes, like how to sing, how to harmonize, and show me different, skill as far as singing and directing a congregation as far as music, or directing a choir.
Sure, yeah.
And I was really interested and drawn to that. And so I started spending a lot of time with him. And then unfortunately, that's when the abuse slowly began. So I was conflicted because now it's not just my mom's a Christian and my dad's not. Now my mom's a Christian, and she's supposedly going in the right direction and doing the right things.
Yeah.
But now I'm confronted with
another Christian.
Here's
apparently.
another Christian, a leader in the church, and now basically takes for granted my love, because I did love this gentleman, and he was like a father figure to me. So now I'm kind of this guy has become like a spiritual father, if you will, and spending a lot of time with me and things. And so now when the abuse entered into the relationship, it brought a lot of confusion, because yes, I was still young, but the greater confusion is Christians, or good people, so to speak, shouldn't do this.
Yeah.
This is what bad people do.
Yeah.
Because you're taught that as a little kid, like, no, let no one touch your no spot and that kind of thing.
Sure.
So those are bad people. So I was very conflicted in my understanding at a very young age of the difference between now good and bad.
Yeah.
I
want to, let's break off just a little bit, because you know how many people, or how more and more common it is that like you hear stories like that. Like, I'll see in comments on hundreds of YouTube videos, oh, I grew up in the church, but then I battled with being abused, or this pastor did something they shouldn't have to me, and automatically, which I don't blame them in a lot of cases, but it's like they're completely turned off to God then.
Yeah.
Like that's it. Like years of trauma, therapy, counseling, and it's just like, a lot of times the conclusion is, well, I got to kind of stay away from that area, because that's what did it to me. That's, and how can I affiliate with something that did that, so there's probably people that could even be watching that they dealt with abuse within a church, or within, the whole idea of like, this person's a Christian, but they still did that, or they still did this. So let's just real quick, because a lot of people, right, which I don't blame them, but they'll blame their abuse, they'll blame their trauma for who they are, or for why they act the way they do. You have people that they say, I'll see people at, pride parades, for example, and, you ask them, when did you kind of realize that, you have this different attraction, right? Like this whole other thing. And a lot of times they say, it was because this happened to me when I was younger.
Yeah.
Like church related or not. They'll just say, this happened to me when I was younger. That's a lot of the stories, not all of them, but and then you see, like I said, then religiously, sometimes, why are you not a Christian? Oh, well, because I was abused. Right? So you have a lot of things, we're talking about nature versus nurture. And, I think everyone can agree that when something that traumatic happens to you, that throws you in for a loop. Like, talk about the cards that you were dealt, And so skip far ahead into your life then. As you went into adulthood, you gave your life to the Lord, you're in ministry, like let's skip far ahead. Explain for the people that are watching, like, number one, when did any sort of healing process or liberation from those events take place in your life? How long was that? Like, was it an overnight thing? Was it, did you ever receive counseling for it? Was it just a moment? Kind of explain like how, because, I'll be a witness to it. Like, I would say it 100% really does not alter or affect the way you live your life today.
Yeah.
Almost as if it never happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And people probably can't even dream of that being a reality for them.
Yeah.
Like they feel like that's a thing that they have to hold around or carry around forever. So explain that, like how were you kind of set free from such a traumatic, not just experience, but like years of, life?
So, wow, this first podcast is like deep.
Let's go. Let's
wow.
go.
Like
70 times 7. Yeah.
I wasn't expecting to tap into all this, but for me, every story is different.
Yeah.
But for me, it took many, many, many years. And I think there's reasons for that.
Sure.
Not excuses. It's just was the reality of the journey that I took. Things got worse before it got better.
Yeah.
Because then I started acting out behaviors and became rebellious and so forth. So then I started making my life worse. And I guess that's how I dealt with, the pain and the trauma of the experiences. So like then I became somebody that I wasn't.
Yeah.
But in some ways I felt like, well, like I guess then that was my lot in life, to just become this tough kid and this rebellious kid. So and now I know my direction. Like now I know who I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
And it is what it is type thing. But if I could rewind, you mentioned like counseling and therapy and stuff. So there was like multiple things that were going on in my life. So it was the abuse, but then it was also where like I had a hard time in school. So
Yeah.
so like I think a lot of that carried over into not only my behavior in the street, but like my behaviors in school.
Yeah.
Now, mind you, nobody knew. So this was a secret till I was 21.
Wow.
I think I was.
What is that, like about figure about 14 years or so.
Yeah, so I held this secret until I got engaged, with mom. And so I was about 21 because we got married when I was 22. So this was mom was the first person, my wife was the first person I told.
Yeah.
And so I think I was like 21 when I told her. But going back into the counseling and stuff, it's interesting because I misbehaved in school.
Yeah.
Because I didn't always go to school, because there was a lot of disrespect and there was a lot of fighting and all those issues in school, the school automatically would like make me go to counseling and things. And then my mom would, and like they called it like support,
Sure.
Support classes. And then I would have counselors that would help like support, because of my behaviors and stuff. But then my mom would also then bring me to Christian counselors because she didn't just want the school to have a voice in my life. Now that she was maturing in Christ, she wanted Christian counselors to be introduced to me as well. So then I went to some Christian therapy and Christian counseling and things. But I think without going into all the details right now, I think here is where more confusion began to build because now I'm getting advice from secular counselors, as we would just say, non-Christian counselors, or, they weren't teaching, biblical value. They were just teaching ways to cope and manage your feelings and emotion,
Yeah.
versus Christian counselors are using the Bible as a roadmap to help deal with emotion and trauma and things through a relationship with Christ and so forth. So now it's two different value systems that are trying to help me. But the main thing that I want to point out is none of it worked. Not even the Christian counseling or secular, none of it worked simply because I was never honest.
Yeah.
So, like I said, when I was 21 is when I told Mom for the first time, hey, I just think you need to know this about me. No one knows this. I've never talked about it, but I feel like it's important as my fiance, soon to be wife, that you know everything about me. And that's when I, came out with it. But that was the first time.
Yeah.
So in all of these sessions, the one thing that all the sessions did have in common, whether they were Christian or not, they all tried to probe and ask me, why do I think I behave this way?
Yeah.
Why do I think? But because I was never honest,
Yeah.
like no one knew how to figure me out. So no one knew, like, I don't know why he's doing this. And, so then they labeled me, so like, I had, all different types of labels.
Well, in fairness too, you're at a young age. So I don't think 8-year-old, a 9-year-old, 10-year-old would be, necessarily in lifetime connecting the dots. Oh, you know what? Because they did this to me, I'm going to act like, I don't know what 9 or 10-year-old would like think about that in the moment. Like, so if, let's say you were willing to be truthful in a moment and a person asks you, well, why are you doing this? Would a 10-year-old think to say, I'm doing this because of...
I don't know, but I know for my personality, I think if they would have probed, and this is, very interesting because, now that we've been, doing ministry and I've been counseling with people for 25, 30 years, if people would have maybe probed a little bit more or pressed a little bit more, I think with my personality, I might have, I might have said something.
Yeah.
But, it's just that it seemed like then when they weren't really understanding the root of my behavior, that's when they just started to put labels on me.
Yeah. Well, because I feel like it's, especially if it's happening to a kid, I don't know if there's a number, but I would say a large majority of the time, it's not even found out until they're older, because it's like, how does a kid even comprehend or voice what happened? Like a lot of times, sometimes I'll watch like documentaries or whatever, and, you hear, it's these people that they lived or they survived like these crazy experiences, whether it's a kidnapping or, being abused. And they'll say like in the moment, they didn't realize what was happening, but they knew something was off. They knew something wasn't right. And obviously then like it impacted them for however long. Now, so for you, so you share it at 21 for the first time. What was then the effect of that? Like for being able to voice it for the first time. So how long then after that point was it until you would say like you were very much set free, or you were able to, disconnect from such an experience?
It was really scary. I remember like the night. I even remember the place where like I had the conversation with Mom about it, and it was very scary because for several reasons. I think number one, I'm about to tell my fiance something that, in my mind, might change the way she views me. The other thing is she knows the gentleman.
That's crazy.
She knows the gentleman. My family knew the gentleman. Her family knew the gentleman. And they didn't just know him because he was a leader in the church.
Yeah.
So not only did they know him, but they were friends.
Yeah.
They were almost like family.
Yeah.
So it was a scary moment because not only was I about to say something that I never said, but there was relationship. Like mom had a relationship with this guy. Like my family had a relationship with this guy. Her family had a relationship with this guy. So the relationships went deep, and he was related to the senior pastor of the church.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of ties, there was a lot of relational ties. And then I think the other thing was just to admit that a guy did what he did to me was scary for me because, today where we live in a day where, homosexuality and bisexual, expressions are not only understood by many and tolerated, but accepted and even to the point of celebrated, right? So I grew up in an age, though, where all of that was opposite.
Yeah.
I grew up in a day where it's like, if you had homosexual tendencies, like for sure you kept that to yourself.
Yeah.
Because you were afraid that, danger would come your way, so to speak. So it was not, in other words, it was not cool at all to be bi or
Gay.
gay. I mean, it just was not cool at all, especially when I grew up, I was born in 75. So basically, growing up 80s, but also not only the time, but where we grew up.
Yeah.
Like New York at that time, like now it's probably one of the
different.
epicenters of the homosexual movement. But in those days, so not only was it the time that I grew up, but the place where I grew up.
Yeah.
It was like the tough guy era.
Yeah.
I grew up in the tough guy era where it was like men are men, and if there's any type of, inclination that you're not manly, we're going to tell you about that. And we're going to tell you about yourself, basically.
Yeah.
So it was that era of, where gangs, was at an all-time high and neighborhood pride and, and then just men being manly, on 100, and women being, womanly and feminine, so I grew up in that age. So me telling mom, that was another thing that bothered me is because, how is she going to look at me? Because not only was I abused, but I was abused by a man. I think too, thinking back, that's probably one of the reasons why I never said anything, because that was so, any type of homosexual act was so frowned upon, seriously frowned upon, that I think that was another reason why I didn't say anything, even though it wasn't initiated and there was no homosexual tendency on my end. However, it was so frowned upon that I think that was one of the major reasons why I never even said anything.
Yeah. So then once you shared it, at what point of your life then did you feel set free from it, a weight off your shoulders about it? Was it in your 20s? Was it until your 30s? When?
So I talked to mommy about it when I was 21, and then after that, we did a series of things that led to the best of our ability, what we would call reconciliation. And what that looked like was I decided that I wanted to come out about this. I didn't just want mom to know. I want my parents to know.
Yeah.
Because there was a part of me too that felt like, and that might be a whole other story, but that there was a part of me that felt like a big reason why I was so rebellious was because of the abuse.
Yeah.
And I was just so angry and so hurt and so wounded that I acted out. And that was the way I dealt with it.
Yeah.
And so there was a part of me that felt like I need to tell my parents this because they need to know.
It wasn't necessarily their parenting
right,
that made you so,
right. One of the
there's more
major
to it.
reasons why I acted crazy was because of this experience.
Yeah.
And it messed with me, in so many different ways that I didn't know how to handle it. And so I acted out this way. So I wanted my parents to know so I can explain. But then also, I wanted to confront the gentleman. And I wanted to confront him. I wanted to confront the wife.
Wow.
Because they were around a lot of younger kids because, they had nieces and nephews. So,
Yeah.
so it was a journey that, that we walked through.
Yeah.
And mom walked through the journey with me. And then my parents eventually then walked
Yeah.
through the journey with me. And so I was 21, but as far as what we would say being completely over it, it took a long time. And I don't say that boastfully at all.
Yeah.
To be honest, I wish that it would have been a quicker process.
Yeah.
My prayer for people is that it doesn't take years and it doesn't take a long time. But for me, it took a very long time, probably a lot longer than it should have, simply because for many years
It wasn't spoken about.
I wasn't, honest about it.
Yeah.
And then when I was honest about it, I think there was a lot of things that I still suppressed even as a young man in my 20s. I think there was a lot of things that I suppressed that were connected to those experiences. And learning how to deal with it now as a Christian young man,
Yeah.
but being free from the effects of it, and then not allowing it to affect my life,
Yeah.
my thoughts, and the way I dealt with people, and then the way I raised kids and so forth. So there was a lot of figuring out. There was a lot of things to figure out, and wanting to do everything well and right. It was like a constant learning and a constant journey. And I held unforgiveness, I think, unknowingly. I didn't say like, oh, I'm not going to forgive him or never forgive him. Because actually, when I confronted him, I said, I forgive you. But I realized years later that there was still yuck in me, in my heart, in my memories and so forth. There was still yuck. And I realized that there wasn't complete forgiveness. And very interesting story that led to the journey of total forgiveness was I found out that he was working. He used to clean the planes at LaGuardia Airport in New York. And I heard that while he was working, his spine, his back collapsed.
Wow.
While he was at work. And then was, of course, rushed to the hospital. And then he had to learn how to walk all over again and that kind of thing. Some freakish thing. I'd never heard of it before that, never heard of something like that since. And when I heard about that, for the first time, I had compassion towards him. And so by that time now, I'm pastoring. I'm a youth pastor now at this point. And I had compassion. And God gave me compassion for the sick.
Yeah.
And so for the first time, I had compassion towards him like I had never experienced.
Did you already talk to them at this point?
Yeah.
So how old were you when you confronted him?
It was probably within 21 or 22.
So this all happened pretty quick.
Yeah.
Like you share it, you tell your parents. That happened quick.
Oh, yeah.
So now down the road, I was born by the time you were a youth pastor. So
Yeah.
what, you're in your 30s?
So I was in my 20s.
You're still in your 20s?
I was in my 20s, I believe, when I felt compassion to actually reach out to him then a second time.
Okay. So that was 20. You were probably late
Close
20s.
to 30.
So then So you reach out to him a second time, and what was that like?
I reached out to him because I felt like the Lord told me to call him, and I felt like the Lord gave me very specific instruction. And he told me to do three things, which was crazy because this gentleman was not even a thought really in my life.
Yeah.
I don't know whether it was just, shoving things under the rug and more like suppressing,
Yeah.
or was it, complete healing? But I realized then at that moment that when the Lord spoke to me about him and I had found out of his accident, the compassion that I had, but then along with the instruction that God gave me, I realized at that moment that I had not completely like forgiven. And I haven't completely let it go.
Yeah.
And so the instruction that I felt like the Lord gave me was, number one, I want you to call him and I want you to tell him that you forgive him. And then number two, I want you to tell him that I forgive him. And then number three, I want you to pray for his healing. Those are the three instructions that I got. So I didn't have his phone number.
Yeah.
My parents didn't have the number, whatever. So I remember that his wife worked at this bank in Queens. And so it was just taking the chance of calling the bank
Yeah.
and asking, does so-and-so still work there? And to my amazement, she still worked there at the bank.
Yeah.
So I was able to get a hold of her through that. And then I asked her for her husband's phone number. And then that's how I got his number. And then that's how I called. But the interesting thing is, and I'm not saying this to throw shade on anybody, but the interesting thing is, I talked to mom about it. I talked to my parents about it. I talked to some friends about it, and to other pastor friends. And everybody that I talked to discouraged me. Like 100%. Everybody that I talked to discouraged me from calling him.
Yeah. Well, you think about, I think anyone watching would, collectively agree, just like out of just your immediate thoughts, like that's crazy. Like that's, I think that would be against every counseling advice. Typically it's like you move away from the area, you get rid of any kind of reminders or triggers or, and it's like completely contradicting what you would think would help you move on, right? So you make the call. So then what was like the call like?
That was crazy. I was very nervous. And now I'm like close to 30, if not 30 already. And I have probably 2 kids at that point.
Yeah.
You and Bianca were born already. I'm a youth pastor.
Yeah.
So now I'm currently in ministry.
Yeah.
And I think what impacted me the most was that the things that moved me the most is the things that God told me to do.
Yeah.
So what is that? Tell him that God has forgiven him. That's a big part of my message is that no matter what you've done, God can forgive you.
Yeah.
The other thing that God told me to do was pray for his healing.
Yeah.
And that was another thing that I was very passionate about. So I thought it was very interesting that the instruction that God gave me for him was something that I would typically do weekly with no hesitation.
Yeah.
But when it came to him, there was a first that like knee-jerk reaction of like, I'm not, like, hey, this is, and I'm just going to be very transparent. Like when I first heard that he collapsed, I'm like, hey, this is God, this is God. Like payback is, is rough, type thing. He's getting what he deserves and stuff. And so, like quickly I went into flesh mode, but then God spoke to me and he told me those 3 things. And I'm like, all right, well, if God's telling me to, minister to him, then obviously his sickness is not from God.
Oh yeah.
And that's when I began to learn even that, where, sickness is not from God.
Yeah.
And God doesn't make people sick to prove himself, or
Yeah.
God doesn't make people sick to prove his point, or because you're rebellious or you're bad. Like God doesn't make you sick. So that was like one of my first, because I've heard that, but that was one of my first real live experiences of I felt like God was directly teaching me.
Yeah.
Like no matter what he's done to you or anybody else, I love him.
Yeah.
And my plan for him is to be healed.
Yeah. And it embodies too, like the most basic, elementary lesson that you would learn of like loving loving your enemies.
Sure.
Literally,
Right.
almost the epitome of what we could classify as a personal enemy, in our world. And, and it's like, literally, I was just teaching I have planned for tomorrow night for the kids' Bible study, Good Samaritan, classic story where literally Jesus is asked, what's the greatest command? And, he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, but equally as important as loving God is to love your neighbor as yourself. And they say, how? And then he goes into the full Good Samaritan story of two people who are enemies who would hate the other, practically racist towards one another and their hometown, their ethnicity. And they, the Samaritan ends up helping, the guy. And he says, go and do the same. Go, literally, what did the Samaritan do? He nursed him back to health.
Yeah,
he literally,
absolutely.
Brought him back to good health, or as much as he could in that moment, took care of his wounds and all that. And he tells us, now go and do the same, and then you have the Sermon on the Mount when he's talking about, if someone, asks for your coat, you take, it's like, all of this is preached very clearly throughout the gospel, throughout the ministry of Jesus, of like, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, all these things. And now it's like God is literally, asking of you to live that out, to now go and do the same.
And that's crazy because, we do know all these biblical principles that align with this, but it definitely is a lot harder.
Oh yeah, we never actually
do it.
The majority of people actually don't apply them. Just look online during elections. And it's like Christians are saying, love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemy, and all of a sudden they highlight the other person as the enemy, and now you have keyboard warriors and all these things and memes being made and pictures and graphics. Like one of the most fundamental and basic things, people will say they know it, but like it's the least followed through, I would say, easily, like for being such a central part of Jesus's teaching. Because he actually says, practically what he says is, this is what separates us from everyone else. He says, you are not a good person if you are good to the people who are good to you. That does not make you a good person. He actually says even the pagans can do that. Yeah. He says, what makes you set apart is when, you're good to the people who hate you. Same thing. He says, if you give money to people expecting for money to be returned, well, that's easy. Anyone can do that. Even pagans do that. Yeah. But if you're able to give without expecting anything in return, that's what sets you apart. So the very thing that Jesus has almost established in the gospel to set us apart, it's probably, it's like easily said, much harder, though, to actually do,
That's true.
But living out his word, do like what he says actually works.
There's truth. Cost.
Yeah, there's cost to it,
Jesus.
but there's actual benefit to doing what he teaches us. Yeah. And so you give the call, you pray for him. Was there anything that took place after you prayed for him?
So crazy. So there was a lot of crying. There was a lot of tears. He just began to weep when he heard my voice, never thinking that I would, call him. But this was, years later. So that was kind of moving to me. And I was just, at that time, I think I was just being obedient but I wasn't like really looking forward to the phone call, but I was just like being
Yeah.
obedient. And I think it turned from just simple obedience to, wow, when I began to, as soon as he heard my voice and he began to weep, I felt like, wow, like this is the heart of the Father. Like
Yeah.
this is, this is legit. Like right here, like what I'm feeling right now, like you alluded to, Jesus is to love your enemies and to love those who come against you and persecute you. And, it's like this is just a small taste of what Jesus felt, or what Jesus it was like for Jesus, But Father, forgive them; they don't know what they're doing, and that kind of thing. But it really then set me up for the ability to go into ministry mode.
Yeah.
It was almost like in
It
seconds.
was a different type of call.
Right.
Yeah.
Now this is not the guy that hurt me.
Yeah.
This is a guy.
It's a counseling call. Now
Yeah.
you're
This is
calling,
a guy that needs Jesus. And this is a guy who needs to know that Jesus died. And because he died and rose again, that there's power in the blood, and there's power of repentance and forgiveness and a newness of life. And that not only can God forgive you, but God loves you so much, that he would stop everything
Yeah.
and set this phone call up, just for you.
Yeah.
And not only that, but then, pray for his healing. And, I was clear, just so that it doesn't sound super spiritual. I was clear, like, this might be the last time, I ever talk to you again.
Yeah.
But I made it clear that I'm literally on assignment from the Lord, and I love you and I forgive you, with the love and forgiveness of Christ. However, I just want you to know and to make it clear, like, this is not going to, be a beginning of a relationship. And that's a whole other conversation, right? Of learning
forgiveness, moving on, keeping people in your life.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and that's a great conversation for another time. But I think too that, when he heard my voice and I began to speak to him about the love and the forgiveness of Christ, and even though he was technically a Christian, so to speak, and I don't know, what he did after those moments and stuff when we had the initial conversation, but I realized that God wants to use you, and that is so much more important to him than to, whether it's standing your ground or being right or trying to act overly spiritual or whatever. Like, I think obedience, and that's why it's like obedience is always better than sacrifice. Like and so for the first time, I really understood that like never before. And then, the call went very well. He was very receptive to it. And then I found out sometime later that the Lord touched him and that he was able to walk, and God, healed his spine and so forth. And so it was an amazing opportunity. It was very difficult, but at the same time, it was amazing.
Yeah. So, we talk about, the whole, how are you raised, what happens in your childhood, affects who you are and all this. But, I think that's a clear example of how, literally if you allow it, there is so much more that can be at play than just your nature or just how you were nurtured, that third and the ultimate factor of Christ in your life, because no person, without, forget a moral compass, forget even being, quote, Christian, like, the Bible talks about that we're completely transformed. A new creation, a new man, a new life, like that's the only possible way something like that you could actually do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like literally, even Christian counselors would not even advise such a thing. I wouldn't advise, oh, hey, call and like talk and just pray for like, and so that's why this conversation is so important, because, just the redemptive power, the transformative power of Jesus, literally being able to transform you, to transform anyone who surrenders their life to him, to be able to do things that you could never even fathom or imagine, or, it just, I think it would blow anyone's mind, when you realize you can have the ability to overcome your trauma, to do things that you thought you would have never do, or fear, or, whatever it is. And so, so to kind of close that chapter, so like around 30, you make the call. Did you feel a difference personally when it came to any sort of trauma, anything like that? Did you feel a difference post that call?
Yeah, I feel like there was a burden that I didn't even realize still existed. That had lifted. The other thing too, in youth ministry, I would have, kids confide in me about some of the things that they had been through.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that I would never say, like, oh, that happened to me too.
Yeah.
And so I can relate. Like I never, like I was pretty private, even, even as a young adult. Like I was still like, wasn't someone to really just share that openly until that time.
Until that call. So would you say that was kind of the point of like no return? Was there something
Because then
else?
I felt very comfortable then
Yeah.
openly sharing that, and that being a part of my story and a part of my testimony, that I felt comfortable, probably for the first time to begin to openly just talk about it.
Yeah. So you would say around 30 was when you would say you felt pretty much, just new or different towards the situation.
Yeah. And just, there was no shame.
Yeah.
There was no shame attached to it. There was no condemnation. There was, because I think too, there was so much unhealthy thought processes, and there was so much rebellion that was attached to that.
Yeah.
That there was a lot of anger, even, believe it or not, even after giving my life to Christ, there was still a lot of like, man, if it wouldn't have been for that, like my life, maybe, I don't know, maybe could have been so different, because I was just, I don't know who I was talking to. I was talking to somebody the other day, and I was like, I remember there was a Bible club in my high school.
Yeah.
And I was one of those kids that, because I was so angry at God, that like I would make fun of the people that were in the Christian club. Like I was that like bully.
Yeah.
And I would make fun of the teacher that was leading the Bible club. I would make fun of him. And then like, even I would find, once I found out like when and where they met, like I would go, to the classroom, and I would bang on the wall and bang on the door, and just to be, and then sometimes I would just, open the door and say stupid things. And so looking back, I can tell that, it really impacted me to the point where I was just angry at everybody. I was angry at church. I was angry at pastors, leaders, so if you were a leader, whether it was a police officer or, my parents, I was just angry at everybody. So when I gave my life to Christ eventually, I still had to work through some of those things.
Well, it's like the process of complete surrender.
Yeah.
Because I think where people get very mixed up is, because I would say without a doubt, the X factor is when you surrender your life to Christ, everything changes. Trauma, addiction, experiences, hurt, sickness, like all those things can literally dissipate when there's a full surrender to the Lord. But where people then get frustrated is they become a Christian, they say the sinner's prayer, they start going to church, but then they don't feel there's a change or they don't feel there's a difference. And then they say, well, this isn't working. But
I feel like that's the key, what you just said, a full surrender.
Full surrender, because you wouldn't have, like, up until that point of 30, you're literally a pastor in ministry. And so it's easy to say, oh, yeah, he surrendered his life to the Lord, which you surrendered a lot of your life to the Lord. But was it a full surrender? The moment of, oh, wait a second. And sometimes you don't knowingly do it. I think that's a big part too. Sometimes it's just things you don't think about or things that are subconscious or, and
things you suppress, things that you got over, but maybe you really didn't.
Yeah. So like and I think that's the key, because if someone was in your shoes at your age of, like figure if you've rewinded to the age of like 27, right? You're Christian, you gave your life to the Lord, you're even in ministry now, you have a family, wife, kids, all this. But then like, if there was still ever a moment or a thought of that experience, there would have to be a little confusion or just, God, what, like, I thought this wouldn't feel the way it does anymore.
Right, exactly.
But, and so youth, it's easy. Like we always give ourselves and we give our mindset, we give ourselves the benefit of the doubt way too much. God, I've done everything. Why do I still feel like this? But the reality was you didn't do everything quite yet. Yeah. And so, that life fully surrendered, but and then partnered obviously with obedience. Because let's say you would have been like, nah, that's just me. Or if you would have listened to man rather than God, everyone you asked about it said, I wouldn't do that. Yeah. If you would have listened to man rather than God, even in that moment, because it's just so bizarre, so almost crazy to the point where there's no way that could have been God that told you that, then who knows, right? Like if you never had that moment, that complete surrender, you could be a part of many stories and people that I see online that they're in their 50s, 60s, and they're still church hurt. Yeah. They're still, angry at a pastor. They're still upset at a religion or at a church, But the reality was there ever complete, full and total surrender? And you don't really know that, I think it's like you don't know if you are completely surrendered or not, but like it becomes obvious when the things that you need to surrender come up. Like it's
I think too, there's like, one of the signs for me is that there were certain things that would still trigger me. Yeah. And I realized, I'm not completely healed with this. Yeah. Like I haven't completely surrendered this. And again, like I thought I did, I meant well and I thought I did, but I didn't realize how much my childhood impacted me. And then also I didn't realize how much the decisions that I made out of rebellion, I didn't realize how much that impacted me. Yeah. So, but then there would be like even like, if like if I saw a pastor like maybe mistreat somebody, all of a sudden that would trigger me. Yeah. Because then I'm like, wait a second, like, and I'm ready to like, blow up the city because now I have this trigger where it's like, wait a second, like, why are you treating somebody like that? And you should know better and blah, blah, blah. And so when these triggers started coming, I was like, like there's some areas in my life that I have not surrendered yet, or I haven't forgiven completely, So, when you said a total surrender, everything changes. That is definitely an accurate statement. When there's a total surrender, everything changes.
Yeah. So then we'll close with this. We won't go too much into me for today, but let's say now in the stage of raising your own kids, right? So your life experiences, your childhood experience, but then obviously, I think a big theme of what we want to make clear is that full and total surrender to Jesus Christ, giving him your life, cancels any sort of nature or nurture. whether it was your nature, you're tough, you're more angry because of what, the whole point is that, the Bible says, you literally, a transformed heart, a new mind, a new spirit, everything is new. And so it doesn't really matter your ethnicity, where you grew up, how you grew up, when your life is completely given to the Lord. That's always like a red flag for me. Like when I hear Christians and they're like, "Oh, well, I get angry because of this."
Yeah.
Or, "Oh, well, I have this." It's like that's usually a giveaway. Well, there's things that are still working out between you and the Lord, a full and complete surrender, because everything, I just preached about this on Sunday. Anything you put into God's hands, anything you surrender to Him, God will always be able to heal it, or, just completely. It's always better in His hands than it is in
Sure,
mine,
absolutely.
And so now with this new outlook, this new, this new faith and everything into your adulthood, now with kids, what were, I guess, some of the biggest things that you didn't want to do with your family? Like, things like, "Oh man, I remember this. I don't want this to happen to my kids." Like, keep this away from the kids. But then what was then the biggest thing you wanted to introduce to your kids?
I think the big thing for me was to be consistent with, raising you guys, like being consistent. Mm-hmm. I think another thing too was to never not live what I'm preaching. So, that was always like a strong, conviction for me, is that like if, for example, if I tell you to clean the toilet, so to speak, then I have to be willing to clean the toilets too.
Yeah.
Or, at another level, if I'm telling you, not to drink or not to smoke or not to watch porn or whatever the case might be, like I took it seriously where, I can't expect you to do something that I'm not willing to do myself. And so that was a big thing for me, is that just consistency and practicing what I preach. And I also think that showing as much love, I think, as possible, and showing, not only love, but just, understanding and conversation. That's why, like, I was always big on communicating and conversation, because, I feel like that's really important to conversate and to have relationship. And so I think those things were like really important to me, because I didn't always feel like I had that. And I always wanted, and it was so funny, like, obviously you don't have to become like the person to relate to the person. But I think there was some times, as you guys were growing up, that like, I wanted to try to be as laid back as possible, because I wanted everyone to feel comfortable, like with just like talking. So whether like I was like, trying to be like the cool parent, or laid back, or chill, or, or hanging out with your friends, or being friendly, to those that, you brought around the house or whatever. Like, I think all that was intentional, because I wanted everyone to feel comfortable, because that wasn't always like my experience and my story. And so I wanted, you guys and your friends to feel comfortable, so that even though I was a pastor, but I was still relatable and I could still talk and be chill. And then I think there was just certain things that, certain challenges that I went through that, I knew some of the warning signs of these things, because I had gone through them. And so, I was just more alert, I guess, to those things as you guys were growing up and maturing. So, It's interesting because, as a parent, especially a new parent, you're always wanting to do everything perfectly.
Yeah.
But even in that, you realize like there's no such thing as perfect parents,
Yeah.
and there's no such thing as trying to handle everything perfectly, because you realize that everyone has different personalities, and everyone still functions in a way where their personality is going to lead to. But you're wanting to really create a safe place
Yeah.
and a safe environment, so that the kids can be who God's created them to be, and not trying to like change
Yeah.
the kids, or not trying to change the personality, or not trying to force them to be something they're not. I remember, that was things that I never said it out loud, but those were things that I would think to myself from time to time. Is like, especially like, the boys, like, I remember growing up how I was and how I felt like I had to be a certain way. I had to be tough, or how I had to carry myself a certain way, or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the challenges for me is not putting that on you.
Yeah.
And not making you feel like, all right, you have to like be this, and you have to be like,
Yeah.
no, because you're not me, and you don't have to be that way. But so I never said things like that out loud, but those were things that I thought about. Okay, because I was tempted. Well, you need to do this, you need to say this, or you need to say this, or you need to dress this way, or talk this way, or whatever. And then I would think about it, and it's like, they don't have to do that.
Yeah.
They have to be. The most important thing is they have to be what God's created them to be, and I'll obviously give them direction and insight and help when needed. But I think the most important thing is not to make you try to be me, and force you to be something that you're not.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, it's just, once again, just going back to the central theme of today of, just how truthfully, and people don't like it because, it really puts the responsibility on us. But like when you invite Jesus into the picture, right? It's like everything before Jesus has the ability to be nullified. Like it doesn't have to carry over into your parenting. Yeah. It doesn't have to carry over into a marriage. It doesn't have to, but it's so easy, it is what it is. It's blame shifting, it's, you
have to be real intentional about it.
Yeah. It's hard work, of course, but I think it's obvious that
it's possible.
Anything that's worth it is always going to be hard work.
Sure.
I don't think anyone wants to have trauma for the rest of their life. No one wants to have a marriage full of arguing for the rest of their life, but it requires that decision of, I surrender this to the Lord. I surrender my opinions, my thoughts, my trauma, my, my life perspective. I surrender that to God, and I'm going to, submit unto His law, His word, His gospel, what the Bible says, because it's available for anyone, the Bible's full of this whole theme of transformation, despite who you are. It was for Jew and Gentile. It was for, slave and free. It didn't matter who it was for, but everyone, think of the famous story of like Paul, right? Literally the guy who was killing and jailing Christians. God, complete surrender, Paul completely surrendered his life to the Lord. And now it's like as if it's literally a completely different person, to the point where, Jesus, felt it appropriate to change his name from Saul to Paul, that literally complete transformation. And these are stories that I bring up that everyone, even if you don't even go to church, you've probably heard of it, and it's like, but it's a perfect example of the gospel, of this whole idea. Like, you don't have to live by who you used to be, or you don't have to blame your parents for the way you act today if you have Jesus in your life. And that's the big if, and so there's still so much more to talk about, but our time for today, I think, is up. We do this just during our work day right now, and we got meetings, we got things to tend to, but first episode in the books. Let's end it right there. First episode in the books, many more to come. Thank you guys so much for being a part of this conversation. Honestly, it did not go the way I was planning. I had this whole thing of notes, but that's the beautiful part. We're here to have conversations. The 70 times 7 podcast, right? We are willing to have as many conversations about any topic that we feel led to do, or maybe things that you want us to talk about. And so I just want to invite you guys, if you enjoyed it and if you want to be a part of future conversations, like, comment, subscribe. And when I say comment about things that you would want us to talk about. Maybe you had similar experiences as my dad did, or maybe you have a question about your faith or about the Bible or about things happening in the world today. That's why we're here. We want to talk about anything and everything. We're not afraid of topics. We're not, because God wants us to live in this world, and this world includes a lot of different things and topics and thoughts and beliefs, but that's what we're here for. We're here to have those conversations, whether they're fun and lighthearted or sometimes even uncomfortable or controversial even. That's what we're here for, because the world is missing good conversation, honest conversation, just about what the Word says and about how we can apply it to our life and how we can apply it to current events and everything like that. And so, guys, thank you so much. And we will catch you guys on the next one. See ya.
God bless you.